TV series has explored a wide variety of issues related to peace, social and economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. This month, we will look at the human condition and at some of our social and political realities from a very unusual perspective. People's awareness of their eventual deaths, even subconsciously, influence their behavior in surprising ways. Empirical research has proved this. Our guest, Greg Bennick, will help us explore this topic. Greg Bennick has extensive experience as a humanitarian activist, world traveler, public speaker, punk rocker, and biographer. For 2 decades, he's been communicating about social issues, and he has spoken in more than 25 countries. He co-produced a feature-length documentary film on this topic, Flight from Death, The Quest for Immortality. Now he is writing the official biography of Ernest Becker, the person who really launched the efforts to study this. Greg has spoken about Becker in more nations around the world than anyone else. He serves on the advisory board of the Ernest Becker Foundation, and I'm happy to welcome Greg Bennick as our guest. Welcome, good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, I appreciate it.
We will have a good time.
We absolutely will.
Greg, let's start by sharing some basic information so people can start to understand this topic. Ernest Becker was a cultural anthropologist who pulled together insights from other fields of study. He wrote a book titled The Birth and Death of Meaning, an interdisciplinary perspective on the problem of man, and a book titled The Denial of Death, and a book titled Escape from Evil. Would you explain these 2 short questions that I'll read from The Denial of Death? One is, all human action is taken to ignore or avoid the anxiety generated by the inevitability of death. The second short quotation is, the idea of death, the fear of it, haunts the human animal like nothing else. It is a mainspring of human activity designed to avoid the fatality of death, to overcome it in some way that is the final destiny for man. Can you tell us what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, the quotes themselves sort of set the tone for everything we're going to talk about over the next hour. The idea that human beings have an innate awareness of their own life and an innate awareness of their own death, and that these things are happening simultaneously, and that they're essentially in conflict with one another in a way. So the result of that conflict is a deep-rooted anxiety in the human animal that we are constantly trying to navigate, work our way through, and in a sense get out of. So we're going to explore those ideas, but those 2 quotes really speak to that central concept very clearly.
People working with Ernest Becker's ideas develop what they call terror management theory. Tell us what terror management theory is.
Yeah, terror management theory is the idea that death reminders or mortality salience, an awareness of our own mortality, causes us to behave in different ways that we might not expect, largely in favor of those who are like us, largely in favor of those culturally approved and agreed on attributes that make us feel soothed about our inevitable mortality. So reminding people of their own death causes them to do very interesting things. And again, we most definitely will get into this as time goes on.
We're planting seeds that we'll be harvesting throughout the hour.
We are, and the terror management work is the empirical byproduct of Ernest Becker's work, meaning it sort of scientifically substantiates Becker's claims.
Right, yeah, the sense of empirical means it's being tested out with actual experiments with people and being proven.
And this is important because earlier when you described Becker as a cultural anthropologist, and it's important to note that he wasn't of any specific discipline, and he certainly wasn't an empirical scientist. So this is the work now being done 40 years after his death.
By social psychologists and so forth that do that. People are afraid that they won't live long enough, but people are also afraid that their lives won't be significant enough. And so we cope with this death anxiety by trying to give meaning to our lives. And we'll be talking about this too. Is there anything you want to say about that at the outset, about meaning for our lives?
We are meaning-hungry creatures, meaning we simply cannot go through life devoid of meaning. It just doesn't quite work that way. And in the quest for meaning, that's where problems start to arise, but it's also where we find an enhanced sense of self-esteem that allows us to continue living. So there's paradoxes all over this work, and that's what makes it really fascinating.
Yeah, it's fun to read about. I really enjoyed.
Oh, I'm glad.
I had done some reading already on this, and to prepare for this program, I had the opportunity then to read a lot more. It's very, very good stuff.
Good, I'm so glad.
Yeah. Well, as we've said, all species have an instinct to live, but only humans know that each of us will die. But people want to deny that reality, so we devise various kinds of anxiety buffers, and including various kinds of cultural systems. Tell us what role our cultures play as anxiety buffers.
Well, if you take even just a quick step back into what you said, we are like all animals. We want to live and to perpetuate ourselves. But unlike other creatures, we can rationalize the fact that we are alive and that we're not going to be alive. That instills in human beings a sense of awe at the potential of life and dread at the potential of death. And as a result, we develop and cling to systems, like you mentioned, cultural systems, for example, that help soothe the sense that we are going to die by connecting us to something greater than ourselves. So there are many different examples of this.
Yeah.
Attachment to family, attachment to community, attachment to those who are like us. These all give us a sense that we are part of something greater than ourselves. If in fact this creature, this Greg that sits before you, is going to die, it makes me feel better to know that I am of a camaraderie of like-minded individuals, or those with awesome beards like you and I. It makes me feel better to know that I'm part of this collective that is greater than myself as I hurtle towards my eventual demise.
Right. In the film that you co-produced, The Flight from Death, somebody in the film says, when the literal world fails us, we turn to the symbolic. I wonder if you could tell us that. I think there's a lot going on there.
Well, symbols represent, say, a cultural value, or they represent personal values. When the literal world promises to kill me and waste me and leave me for the maggots, I can't fathom that. Becker suggested we'd be in a state of abject terror. Ernest Becker suggested we'd be in abject terror if we really contemplated our own mortality in this regard. So when that literal world fails us, we turn to those images which are beyond the literal. We turn to those images which represent a world beyond this tactile world. Because in connecting to that world beyond this tactile world, the sense that we have on a psychological level, on a deep psychological level, is that we are in fact connecting ourselves to something greater that will survive long after we are gone. So the symbol of the culture, the flag, would represent something greater than just any individual member who stands underneath that flag. So we turn to the symbolic representations of our culture when we feel as though death is too potentially overwhelming.
So that would be like nationalistic things, like you mentioned, the flag could be religious symbolism, religious images, religious doctrines,
absolutely,
which are abstracted, symbolic things, not tangible.
Let's look at a very, very common one. The cross could very easily be seen as a symbolic representation of the conflict of women and men, human beings on this earth, as they exist between the vertical, the symbolic, and the horizontal, the earth, the literal. The image of Christianity, quite literally, is of humankind crucified between earth and sky. It's the crucifixion of humankind between the literal and the symbolic. This is a perfect example of what we're talking about.
And of course it has, as part of that theology, the fact that death doesn't win, that we come back after death. So
it's ongoing.
And that you have that in some other faiths as well.
Absolutely.
We want to be immortal, and so when a person or a culture or somebody who is the other tries to conquer or dominate somebody else, is that a way to seek to be immortal? If my country can beat the crap out of your country, does that help me feel immortal?
Absolutely, because the culture is symbolic. The country is symbolic. So in the midst of knowing that we're going to die, thinking our way out of it, creating systems that make us feel better about ourselves, that give us a sense of meaning, that satisfy the needs of a meaning-hungry creature. What happens when we come up against somebody of another culture for whom meaning is derived in another way that maybe is in conflict with ours? Well, it stands to reason that we have to do something about that person, because their truth and our truth, if in conflict, and if both soothing our death anxiety, are coming up against one another. Well, they can't exist at the same time. How could my truth and your truth coexist? So that's the roots of a lot of global conflict and a lot of geopolitical conflict, certainly.
But at the beginning of this conversation a few minutes back, you used the term self-esteem, and there's something of that in what we're talking about too, because some of the ways that people seek immortality or meaning for their lives are positive, like seeking self-esteem and taking heroic actions. And I wonder if you could tell us about self-esteem and heroic actions.
And let's be clear about self-esteem, that people don't equate it with ego, for example. We're not talking about self-esteem as ego, but rather self-esteem as a sense of value, a sense in oneself that one is a valuable participant in a meaningful culture. So with that in mind, this is tricky ground, because the heroic action that I might define as self-esteem enhancing might be very different than the heroic action that someone else defines as self-esteem enhancing. For example, I think it would be self-esteem enhancing to sit and talk to you about Ernest Becker's ideas in hopes that your listeners and viewers find something valuable there. Someone else might find a heroic and self-esteem enhancing action, the flying of a plane into the side of a building. These are arguably, if we look at the term literally, heroic actions in terms of pursuing heroism, but they're most definitely, we can get into an argument or a conversation about what's positive and what's negative there.
When in some of these cases where somebody's done a mass shooting, often they're described as somebody who didn't feel good about himself, who felt like a loser, an outsider, and he wanted to do something to get famous. And so now everybody knows that guy's name, you know. And that's a heroic action, not that it's a positive heroic, but it's a way for this guy to make his mark on the world. And I think of people who feel powerless, but if they can write graffiti on a wall downtown, now I've literally left my mark on the world.
Absolutely.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and let's be clear that we don't condone people flying planes into buildings or shooting people. Like, absolutely categorically don't support that in any way, shape, or form. But the person who carries out the mass shooting is taking a road to the heroic in their own mind, that even if they are in fact killed, I'd suggest they're thinking to themselves, even if I'm killed, the story of me will transcend this temporal existence.
Right, and a lot of those mass shooters do end up either killing themselves or getting killed by the police or something, but that doesn't take away from their bold action where they made a name for themselves.
Right, and I mean, part of the problem, part of the reason that we're perpetuating a culture in which shootings keep happening, part of the problem with that is that we are instilling in people the idea that they can achieve a heroic status by, in fact, simply shooting people. Because they're going to get the fame. They're going to get the fame from that, regardless of whether or not they live or die afterwards.
Let's dig a bit deeper into the broader meanings and implications of this denial of death and death anxiety that we started with. Besides fearing that our lives won't be long enough, we fear that our lives will not be significant enough. And we talked about that. And so people cope with death anxiety by doing things that will give meaning to their lives. We've talked about that. People adopt powerful parts of their culture like nationalism, religion, the arts, pride in their occupational skills. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to make your mark on the world, or to feel like this is who I am now, you know. Something that I saw about these ideas mentioned two psychological constructs. I want to read these, they're short, then ask you to comment on them. Psychological construct number one says, individuals need to maintain faith in a meaningful worldview. And then psychological construct 2 says, individuals need to feel as though they are valued and protected members, objects of significance within this worldview. And that's about self-esteem and so forth. Could you comment further on that sense?
We have to be creatures of meaning. We cannot go through existence with no sense of meaning, no sense of value, as if we individually don't matter. We simply can't do that. The human animal is not constructed for it. So in the midst of pursuing meaning, we often adhere ourselves to causes or to belief systems or to cultural structures which make us feel part of something greater than ourselves. You know, we discussed this a little bit earlier. You know, the issue at hand is, you know, the issue of greater good, essentially, meaning when we adhere to a belief system or an idea, are we in fact adhering to a belief system or an idea which serves the greater good or simply serves ourselves, as we talked about in that moment of the mass shooter going completely berserk and killing people? That, I'm going to suggest, even though technically, sure, we can define it as heroic, and I'm saying that in quotes, we simply don't want that collectively or individually to exist.
Okay, so we get thrown a curve these days because our world is changing so rapidly in so many ways. We have rapid changes in technology, rapid changes of relationships and understandings across races, different social understandings of sexual orientation, rapidly changing political movements. All this stuff there's a lot of turmoil going on. All kinds of stuff is changing, and it's unsettling when people want to feel some grounding. And so how does what you're talking about pertain to this rapidly changing chaos around us?
Well, I mean, we talked about self-esteem and finding meaning. How do most people find meaning? Millions and millions of people find meaning, and how many people click like on the way that that individual has portrayed themselves on the internet? So in a non-temporal, non-face-to-face existence, we place ourselves out in the world in hopes that people will like us digitally, and we find self-esteem in that structure somehow, yet nothing has changed for us. We haven't even maybe done anything other than typed a few words or posted a picture. So, you know, in a rapidly changing world, the first idea that comes to mind is like culture, the way that we pursue likes in a virtual world rather than do something that we actually like in this very real, concrete, temporal world.
So this abstractness of it, to my way of thinking, it sort of empties a person out, or it could empty a person out rather than build a more grounded kind of self-esteem.
Start posting now. Just start posting. Start posting, and watch your likes go up and down and define yourself that way. And tell me at the end of all that, try to convince me that you have developed yourself in a way that is substantive. And I'm going to suggest that there are better ways to do that.
A moment ago I mentioned these two psychological constructs that allow people to function securely in the world. If these are threatened, people feel threatened and people need to defend these. And social psychologists have developed a hypothesis that they refer to as mortality salience, which means just like awareness of mortality. It's how much mortality has an impact, has an effect. Would you clarify what the mortality salience hypothesis means? And after you've done that, then we'll look at some examples.
Sure. The idea is that if you take a group of people and you ask them to contemplate a situation, and I'm being vague, but we'll get into specifics, and say you remind half the group subconsciously that they're going to die, more often than not, that group, that control group, are going to respond to that situation in very different ways than the group that was not reminded of its own death in the midst of the experiment. So the mortality salience hypothesis suggests that when you remind people of their own death, they're going to react to a situation in ways differently than they would have had they not been reminded of their own death.
And there's been a lot of research about this. Can we talk about some practical evidence where scientists have actually been able to prove what you've just said?
Sure. One of the famous examples was a case of municipal court judges in Arizona, where municipal court judges were asked to deliver punishment, essentially, to somebody who was a lawbreaker. This was a hypothetical case. So you take a group of judges, all asked to deliver punishment to somebody and set a bond for that lawbreaker. So municipal court judges share a common idea, a common worldview. Half of them were reminded of their own death, And that can be done in a number of different ways. In the midst of a questionnaire, before the experiment even starts, one line of that questionnaire could be briefly describe the feelings aroused in you when you contemplate your own death. That's all it takes. You could set those judges near a funeral parlor, and that would be enough of a reminder. Well, when then asked to deliver the bond, the punishment to the lawbreaker, those judges who were reminded of their own death delivered a punishment that was far more intense than the punishment delivered by those people who were not reminded of their own death. The meaning behind that is that in both groups of judges, where both groups held a value that following the law had value, reminding someone of their own death caused them to hold on to that cultural value even tighter and lash out against somebody who broke that cultural value, or as a lawbreaker whose cultural value system stood against those who valued the law. Thus, the lashing out in terms of a harsher punishment.
And there's been, from what I understand, there have been like hundreds of these experiments with different scenarios, different setups, different ways of doing that death reminder, different kinds of things where it might be something about your attitudes toward immigrants. It could be about this or that.
The environment, and
so
globally as well.
Do you have another example you could share? That one is compelling.
It's a very compelling one. There have been studies done with the environment, just to take it out of the social realm and into the environmental realm, that people, when reminded of death, respond more harshly to the natural world than they do if they are not reminded of death. Meaning that a reminder of death causes people to want to conquer or dominate the natural world. For example, before being reminded of death, in one particular study, there were people who were asked to contemplate their feelings about an environmental outcome or environmental situation, I guess. And just to put it very simply, people who were not reminded of their own death favored a forest, for example. And people who were reminded of their own death imagined that forest being cleared and a house being more comforting, right? So the idea being that when reminded of death, lashing out against the natural world is a way that we can actually find our power again, because being reminded of death is incredibly disempowering. So,
when we talked a moment ago about heroic activities, and again, not that every heroic activity is positive, but these, that kind of a strong thing. There's a concept that comes to mind also about immortality projects. It's like doing something that is like really leaving your mark on the world. Tell us about this concept of immortality projects.
well, if we think about it,
Or give some examples,
of course,
perhaps.
of course. Yeah, if we think about it, if we're terrified about our own mortality, and if we're trying to find meaning in the world, what we're going to do is we're going to create an object or a persona or a life or a way of being that makes us feel better about existence as it is, makes us feel better about being alive, makes us feel better in the face of our own death. These are the immortality projects. Maybe it's the raising of a family. Maybe it's the chasing of a career. Maybe it's the development of a personality in a guy who uses his hands and hand gestures and speaks to you emphatically. These are all projects of the self, projects of society and socialization that lead us to feel better about the fact that eventually we're not going to be here.
So you might create some art and the art outlives you, or you might write a book and people read that even after you're gone, or
you might fly your plane into a building, and again, I don't condone it or back it in any way, shape, or form.
But it's serving that kind of a psychological need
to perpetuate
or
oneself.
be a peace activist, or
hopefully, yes.
Or whatever. I mean, there's lots of ways of doing these immortality projects, and that can help give some meaning to our short
our
lives.
existence. Absolutely.
If culture serves a death-denying function, then reminding people of their mortality should reinforce holding on to their beliefs and tending to reject people who are different. You mentioned this already. And that's been shown in some social psychological research as well?
It has, absolutely. I mean, and all over the planet, too. I mean, we tend to gravitate towards those who are like us in situations. And different cultures in different countries, realistically, or more accurately, people show a propensity to even sit closer to people who they perceive of as being of their own shared nationality when reminded of death. They collectively kind of gather towards one another. You know, Germans will sit closer to, you know, people who they perceive of as also being German when reminded of death.
Yeah.
And the suggestion is that reminders of death cause us to try to cling more tightly to those things that are familiar to us.
So, is it also true then that people might want to repel or reject or dominate the other, somebody who is not so much like us?
Absolutely.
In us versus them kind of way.
An us versus them. I mean, it sort of calls into an ominous question about how death reminders might in fact be used to manipulate public opinion of differing others, of, for example, of immigrants. You know, it's something that comes up during election time where we're reminded of our death, say, in a commercial or some sort of something for a popular candidate, and then as a result, maybe we start to think of others in ways that are negative, whereas maybe we wouldn't have otherwise.
I got that question coming up in just a moment, so we're almost there.
Got the precursor.
There's a note here that I took when I watched your film, Flight from Death. Sheldon Solomon, who's one of the great researchers and writers on this, says, "My God is better than your God, and we will kick your ass to prove it."
Yeah, well, that's it.
That's his way of doing verbal expression. I mean, that's his style.
Yeah, for sure.
But it really is. You look around the world around us, and you see a lot of that happening.
Yeah, history is replete with examples of people killing each other in the name of their God or their immortality.
Yeah. You mentioned flying airplanes into buildings, and of course the attacks on September 11, 2001 significantly changed the U.S. and our culture and our politics in a number of ways. Is there anything else you could say about that in light of the conversation that we're having?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, George Bush, president at the time, for those who recall, George Bush at the time had one of the lowest approval ratings of any president, if not the lowest approval rating, and somebody can fact check me on that one, but an extremely low approval rating in the history of the United States. Well, September 11th happens, and within weeks, his approval rating has skyrocketed and is incredibly high. Why is that? Well, he basically gave us the idea that you were either with us or you're with the terrorists, and that he was sent from the divine, basically, to lead this so-called crusade against the
And he
evildoers.
said that. I mean, he said felt like he was chosen by God to do this.
Yeah, well, let's be very clear that politicians are very well aware of Ernest Becker. Bill Clinton has explicitly suggested, not even suggested, he's outright said that The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker is one of his top 10 favorite books. You know, the Karl Roves and Bill Clintons and what have you.
Yeah.
These are people who are incredibly, perfectly aware of Becker's work. So Bush, for example, was very well aware of the fact that if he declared himself the chosen one of God to lead the crusade against the evildoers, that people, in a time of feeling insecure, because their great symbolic system of America had a blow against it, would latch on to him. And he rode the coattails of that for years and years.
Yeah. Today's topic also has strong implications for understanding various kinds of bias that exist in our culture, and we've touched on that a bit. Bias against races that are not white, bias against sexual orientations that are not straight, bias against other groups that are different in whatever ways from the dominant culture, whatever that is. Is there anything else you want to add about that, the bias against whoever's different?
Yeah, you know, I've come to think over the years that human beings by nature are relatively intense creatures. We are not calm and benign creatures. We're relatively intense. We have propensities to want to lash out at those who are not like us when reminded of death. But it's not just nature, it's also nurture. People often ask the question of, you know, are we creatures of nature or are we creatures of nurture? Well, uniquely, we are both. We are, you know, creatures who have the potential to lash out at others who are different than us. But at the same time, we have the cognitive ability to imagine a reality other than beating the crap out of another human being. So it is our responsibility as people to nurture ourselves away from hatred, even in moments of insecurity, when we're reminded, in whatever way we are reminded, consciously or subconsciously, of our own potential non-existence. It's essential that we are constantly enhancing ideas of life, vitality, and peace, even though sometimes ideas of life are overwhelming. You know, Becker says the great boon of repression is that it allows us to, shrink away from death by attaching ourselves to life. The irony of which being that life itself is what causes the anxiety in the first place, because it reminds us of death. We're never going to escape that.
Yeah.
It's our responsibility to continually be moving towards peace and compassion and understanding, especially with those who are different than we are.
Yeah, there's been a lot written and studied about how, for example, in a retail store, the white sales clerks will be like watching a young black person as a potential shoplifter in a way that they would not watch a young white person. Or that police will shoot a black guy who's holding a camera or holding some other object that's not a gun and say, oh, I thought that he was holding a gun.
Right.
You know, so there's that the perceptions, the filters, and the biases and the assumptions play out in a bunch of ways.
Right. So the training can't just be, here, cop, here's a picture of a camera, here's a picture of a gun, learn the difference. Yeah. The training has to be constant reevaluation using the cognitive faculties available to us as people. Constant reevaluation using those abilities to think that lead us toward an understanding of those around us beyond just the way that we'd initially gut feel react to them. Yeah. Because the potential of the gut feel reactions, especially when we're manipulated beyond our control, are potentially deadly.
Yeah. And there are people who are out there trying to manipulate for their own self-serving purpose.
Absolutely.
Politicians that want to get, like when Trump says, make America great again, and people hear it as make America white again.
100%.
You know, that kind of stuff. I want to check in on something related here. A lot of the power in the concepts that you're discussing is embedded in the reality that even if we don't consciously think about our deaths, reminders of our mortality exist all the time in very unconscious ways. So we're being triggered, right, without our consciously being aware that we're being triggered. Can you tell us some about that phenomenon?
Rudolf Otto called it the mysterium tremendum et fascinans. Let me translate that into English for you. And not just a direct translation, but the mystery of the tremendous and the mystery of the fascinating. That we are constantly in the midst of being overwhelmed by the tremendous, the weight of existence, the weight of our potential, the weight of death. And at the same time, we are drawn towards the fascinating elements of life, the ability to connect with someone new, to have conversations, to fall in love. That we're constantly caught between those two worlds. And we're caught between those two worlds on a deep psychological level because we are temporary creatures. 100 years from now, it's not going to be us sitting in these chairs as much as we'd like it to be. But we're also, influenced by sources beyond our control at times, sources that are very literal, that come to us through advertising, it comes through us through media, through the things we're literally told that trigger us in ways that are, that are potentially really threatening when we react to them.
Well, and then we get triggered. The news. Oh, here's another shooting. The news. Oh, here's another whatever. It's like we're getting re-triggered every time in the news, and people can perceive the world to be a lot more violent than it is, and so you want to get a lot more geared up to fight.
Terror management studies have shown that when reminded of death, voters cling to leaders or potential leaders who promise to protect the symbolic structures. We would more likely, when reminded of death, want to vote for somebody who said, we're going to go to war, we're going to build a wall, we're going to make America great again. All it takes is those death reminders. And people have said throughout this election cycle, which no matter what election cycle somebody's watching this in, people have said in this election cycle that the more conservative candidate is one terrorist attack away from the White House. Because people's opinions will shift towards the person who promises to protect the symbolic structure that gives those individual voters a feeling of calm.
Yeah, and we've seen this in the past. You remember in 1964, the Democrats ran the anti-Goldwater film of the mushroom cloud and the little girl, because Goldwater was perceived as being reckless if he ever got his finger on the button. And that mushroom cloud, this ad was still being talked about from 1964 till now. and the Willie Horton ads that a Republican running against a Democrat used because the Democrat, as governor, had let a guy out on parole or a weekend pass, furlough, yeah, and committed a bad crime, and so then the hardcore tough on crime candidate running against this liberal do-gooder guy,
Sure.
had ads about Willie Horton, who happened to be a black guy, and it just triggered. And you get this on a lot of the advertising, and I'm noticing in this election season running up to November 2016, you know, everybody's aware about how Trump is promoting fear of Arabs, fear of Muslims, fear of Mexicans, fear of whatever. But if you look at a lot of the Democrats' campaign, it's all about fear of Trump.
Right.
And it's fear of Trump, fear of Trump, fear of Trump. Where's your positive agenda, you know? And so they're playing to the fear. I mentioned our program topic to a friend who said, well, we should be telling people to be afraid of Trump. And I said, a better strategy might be to run ads saying, I really enjoy having friends who are different from me, friends of different religions. I enjoy having friends of different races and different sexual orientations. Boy, that feels good.
And terror management studies have shown that reminders of life at times lead people to have less reactions towards mortality salience or death reminders. There have been studies that show reminders of flying have the same effect. And while that sounds like I've just gone off the deep end, you know, when you think about flying, if we imagine ourselves as having the ability to fly, that's very uplifting.
It's a powerful,
absolutely powerful visual symbol. So
when you and I met in April this past year, and we were talking about this stuff at a workshop that I had organized, and I mentioned that in 1982, when Thurston County Nuclear Weapons Freeze Campaign won a ballot issue in Thurston County, Washington, against nuclear weapons, that instead of having a slogan that was all doom and gloom, our slogan was, ain't it great to be alive? And it just put a better spin on it, and we won in a landslide.
yeah, people want that.
Yeah.
You know, people absolutely want those affirmations of life.
Yeah. Let's see. Now, this stuff that you're talking about is actually universal as part of the human condition. It's not a Western thing. It's not an American thing. It's all over. And you tell us about your speaking tour to 23 cities in Russia?
Yeah, I actually, as far as we know, I've done the most extensive speaking and spoken word tour of Russia that's ever been done by someone from the States. I did 23 cities across Russia, and in every city I told stories from my punk rock background and talked about Ernest Becker and showed the Flight from Death film, and then asked for audience feedback. So it wasn't just me yammering away like a lunatic, but rather that I got feedback from people locally. And what was fascinating was that if you had asked me before the tour of Russia what that would be like, I would have suggested to you, well, you know, I'm not sure what the Russians are going to think. The Russians responded exactly as they do in Kalamazoo, Michigan, or Prescott, Arizona. They have the same concerns about toxic leadership. They have the same concerns about family and friendship and love and vitality. And their questions could have come from any screening domestically as well as it did, you know, across their country internationally.
When we were on the phone to prepare for this interview, you told me that, well, I already knew that you had been a punk rocker for most of your adult life, but you told me the story about how you discovered Ernest Becker's ideas, and I wonder if could you share that story with our TV viewers?
I'd be happy to. I was given 3 books upon my college graduation: Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death, Otto Rank, Art and Artist, and Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, by a professor friend of mine named John Wilson. Gave me these books, and I didn't read them for a long time, and he saw me on the street and challenged me to read them, and I did. And I found that the lyrics of the punk rock band that I was playing in were affected by Ernest Becker primarily. And at the time, I looked online and found that there was an Ernest Becker Foundation with an upcoming conference about Becker's ideas.
Yeah, they do that in Seattle every October.
Yeah,
if I
don't think
correctly.
they're doing. Yeah, they did for many years. They're not doing the conferences anymore, but they're doing constant outreach on you know, Ernest Becker, you know, via their website and whatnot. Point being that they were having a conference, and I wrote to them and said, I'd like to come to your conference. I'm this punk rocker who plays in a band, and I'm interested in Becker. So I went to the conference. And at the conference, I was sitting in the back row, and there were academics delivering papers in front of a room full of academics. And after one finished his paper, he sat down, and the director of the Ernest Becker Foundation at the time, Neil L.G., stood up and said, "Thank you very much for that wonderful paper. Is Greg Bennick here?" And I didn't respond at first. I was kind of ashen and just shocked. And my girlfriend at the time sort of hit me on the arm, like, "Hey, you're here. He just said your name." And he says again, "Is Greg Bennick here?" I sort of sheepishly raised my hand, and he says, "Why don't you come up, Greg, and tell us what you're doing with your band?" So I walked up to the front of the room, and I turned and I faced this entire room full of professors and PhDs, and I said, "My name is Greg Bennick, and I'm on tour with my band, and I just wanted to maybe recite some lyrics that were influenced by Becker's work." And I recited the lyrics to this room full of people, and they were most appreciative of the lyrics that I shared.
And you told me that a bunch of them wanted to get the CD.
Yeah. What happened was, what I said to them was, the end of this song, it's a song called Reflections, and the lyrics are, "On the eve of the apocalypse, you can burn these words into my flesh. We are the tortured and insane, disillusioned and mundane, unknown and unnamed, desperate and enslaved, and we want something more." And I said to the audience, "If you'd like a copy of the CD, please let me know." And I expected to be bombarded with academics who would throw me out the window along with all promises of CDs. But instead, by the time I got back to my seat, I had 17 business cards in my hands from folks who wanted just different angles on Becker. Because that lyrical quote speaks to the ideas we're talking about. We want something more, even though we are just rooted in a very difficult to manage world.
Right. And so it makes me wonder, how many other ways are there to work these issues, these ideas out, through the arts or through
a myriad of ways.
I mean, what about when you're raising kids? What could school teachers do? What could parents do? What can we do for those of us that are politically active or whatever?
Even if there's not a to-do, the very act of raising kids is a very life-enhancing activity. It doesn't have to be seen as a constructive illusion of sorts. It's very, very tangible and very real.
These insights are powerful and practical, and I'm wondering, how could we use these insights to actually improve American society and American politics? And people in other countries can figure out how to use them to improve their country. But how can we use these right here in this country?
I'm going to suggest, and I'm thinking in terms of also activism and peace movements too. Let's give people opportunities to enhance their heroism in ways which are nurturing to them and nurturing to those around them, instead of just promoting continually the idea that individuals self-serving are our champions. I would love to see more of a cultural shift towards enhancing heroic activity, which is nurturing for the individual because it's nurturing for other people, that would immediately start to build stronger senses of community. And if we do that while recognizing that building community of like-minded individuals is potentially a defense in and of itself, we can then constantly be reevaluating what community means. And instead of just saying, okay, good, I've done this thing, it feels heroic, everyone around me likes and agrees with the idea, and we're all similar in that regard, if at that moment we then say, how do we expand this community to those who are unlike us, then those actions become heroic in a brand new way, and we start to redefine community. I think that would strengthen not only our country, but I mean, national borders aside, I think it would start to strengthen our world.
Way better than having more nuclear weapons, which is what Congress and Obama are wanting to spend a huge amount of money doing.
The last thing we need is more nuclear weapons and more drones and more killing people around the world. We need to absolutely be thinking about why we want drones to be killing people, why we want the capacity to destroy the earth with a nuclear weapon, why we want the capacity to kill and dominate. And I think that the work that we're talking about sheds some light on that. And let's be realistic that I'm not here as an emissary, as a mindless drone of Ernest Becker, because Becker would have hated the idea that we're sitting here talking about him. I think that he would have been absolutely aghast. He would have said, just go out there and be living your life in a more fascinating way. Don't create a cult of personality around me. So if we take this as the wellspring, potential wellspring of amazing ideas that we can then use in our lives, that's a great use for all this information.
At the April event where we met, during the questions and answers, somebody was asking about nuclear weapons, and I gave this example that I had a moment ago. I don't know if it was you or your co-presenter who said that subconsciously nuclear weapons, because even though they're extremely threatening to the whole world, the intention of them is to protect us, and they become a death reminder, but they end up being, people allow that to happen, and if we need to get out of that death spiral.
I wholeheartedly agree. Again, it's nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
The nature dictates that we want to have a weapon that will dominate the world, because then our culture, our symbol will survive. We have to get out of that mindset and ideology.
Yeah.
It's never going to create a situation where you and I get out of death, where we cheat death because we have the coolest drones or we've got the most powerful bomb. We're not getting out of it. You and I are food for worms. Everybody watching this is too.
Yeah.
But rather than make it so that, I say that and don't follow it up, because I don't want your viewers to hear, oh, we're food for worms, and they either shut the TV off or they go jump out the window. What we'll say is, okay, so we're food for worms. We have to develop a more rational and comprehensive and compassionate relationship with death, and as a result of that, then enhance life in whatever way we can. I think that it's antithetical to human existence to continue in a death spiral that enhances militarism.
It avoids the real issues that we need to grapple with, and it's an illusion.
It's much harder to be compassionate towards somebody than it is to shoot them. So I think that we need to be aiming towards compassion and understanding constantly.
So do you have similar approaches toward protecting the environment and climate? We certainly need the environment for our lives and the climate for our lives and for our well-being as well as our survival.
Yep.
How can we use these ideas that you're offering related to protecting the environment, protecting the climate?
Well, I'm going to suggest that human beings are largely lazy creatures oftentimes when it comes down to it, and especially in our culture. We don't even have to get off the couch to change the temperature in the house, make toast, change the TV channel, whatever. We don't have to move. And I think that, with comfort and convenience comes forgetting that comfort and convenience comes with a price. And oftentimes, especially in regards to the way we drive rather than ride bikes, the way that we discard of garbage and whatnot, these are huge environmental concerns. But remember that these actions serve a function, because if we feel like we're in domination of the earth, we feel empowered potentially. So continual reminders of this information can maybe push us in other directions and help us make other behavioral choices.
I was thinking about that and some of the topics that we were mentioning a few minutes back about ways that people avoid the reality that they're dying. So if I'm a compulsive shopper, if I get meaning for my life by shopping, it's like I'm in charge. When really I'm mortal. But oh no, I'm not mortal, I'm in charge. Look at all the stuff I've got.
Look at all the stuff you've got. And people define themselves by their money, by the stuff they've got, by how big the house is, by how fast the car is, how flashy the watch is. And sorry to say, none of those things, sorry retailers, sorry purchasers, none of those things are gonna save us. So the question becomes, in the midst of those potentially destructive illusions, and I'm not saying don't have a watch, but in the midst of finding our self-esteem by way of the quality or value of the watch, can we instead create constructive illusions in a different way, rather than relying on potentially destructive illusions, which are just going to end up with us feeling empty?
I want to just put in a plug for the book that you're writing, the biography of Becker. He developed these ideas from the early 60s into the early 70s, and he died relatively young, and now you're writing a serious biography that's going to take you 3 years.
And hopefully a fun one too. Meaning,
good,
I mean, these are serious ideas.
But I mean, it's a substantive, as opposed to a lightweight thing, but you're writing a substantive.
Right. What I'm trying to do is write the definitive biography of Ernest Becker and infuse it with ideas from his intellectual development.
Uh-huh.
I want it to be a book that everyone wants to read because he's a fascinating individual.
Yeah.
And at the end go, whoa, I learned something about the way that he communicated these ideas and developed them.
Yeah.
That would be really fascinating.
That would be fun. And these kinds of ideas have been publicized, of course, by the Ernest Becker Foundation, which we mentioned. I want to put in a good plug for that. It's based in Seattle. And I've known about the Ernest Becker Foundation for a number of years. I'm glad that we've met this past spring, and I thought this would be a good TV program. I've enjoyed reading quite a lot at their website, www.ernestbecker.org, and I encourage people watching the show to get information. They have a Seattle phone number, 206-428-1964, and you're on their advisory board, so I'm sure they're getting good advice from you. I enjoyed watching the 90-minute documentary film that you produced, Flight from Death, and then the subtitle is The Quest for Immortality. It really did a good job of laying out the ideas and giving examples, and people can watch a trailer of that film through the Ernest Becker Foundation website, ernestbecker.org. And there's also a 4-minute video also on that website called The Surprising Ways Death Shapes Our Lives. And if people were to visit the website, click the resources part, and then click the terror management theory part, and then you'll see this little video called The Surprising Ways Death Shapes Our Lives. That's a good quick introduction.
Yeah, and the thing
well.
is that we're trying to cover in the span of an hour basically a synthesis of Western and European philosophical and psychological thought that Becker took a lifetime to synthesize.
Yeah.
So what I'd suggest is if people are still with us and still watching at this point and still interested, to dive in a little bit more and check out the Ernest Becker site and Google some of these people that we've talked about.
And your film is watchable from a number of sources.
It is.
And so they could do a web search for Flight from Death, The Quest for Immortality. And
That's right.
At the end of the program, we'll have ways for people to find these. So I want to thank Greg Bennick for helping us understand death anxiety and its implications for human beings and human society and how we function and
Thank you.
how to make the world a better place. That's all good stuff. I want to thank the people who've been watching this interview. I do encourage people to visit the website for the Ernest Becker Foundation, www.ernestbecker.org, 206-428-1964, for an interesting 4-minute summary of the issue that, as I mentioned, visit the Ernest Becker website, click the Resources tab, then on the pull-down menu, click the Terror Management Theory link, and then click the link for the 4-minute video, The Surprising Ways Death Shapes Our Lives. I also encourage people to watch your 90-minute documentary film, Flight from Death, The Quest for Immortality. You can watch a short trailer for that through the Ernest Becker website, and the full movie is available from several sources. I'm posting all these links in the summary of that I will write about what our interview was, and that'll be posted next to the link for watching this program at the TV programs part of www.olympiafor.org. So visit www.olympiafor.org, click the TV programs link, and then click the link next to watching the program. It'll be in Word format, so you'll see that. I invite people to use these ideas, as you've been suggesting, in our grassroots organizing for peace, human rights, social justice, the climate, and other progressive issues that we work on. You can get information about a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, and nonviolence by contacting the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093 or www.olympiafor.org. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can make the world a better place, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs what you have to offer. There's your Immortality Project, to do something for peace and justice and nonviolence and human rights. Thank you all so much.